So today on our follow-up episode with Pastor Will Barlow, we're talking about physics. Are you ready, Will?
I'm ready.
All right. So here's my first question slash observation. You began session 6 talking about light's particle wave duality and general relativity and quantum theory. And you sounded pretty excited to describe these phenomena. Why do you get so excited about physics? What is it about this that gets you going?
I think it goes back to my upbringing, my childhood, and always really enjoyed math. Math always really made sense to me. And I still remember sophomore year of high school taking physics for the first time and and learning about these equations and realizing that I could go, take like the little, you remember the train track things where they have the little magnets on them and you do like momentum stuff with it where you like throw the one train into the other train and then slow down. And we
Uh-huh.
had these little old speed gates from I don't know, they probably made them in the 80s, but these gates that would let you figure out how fast they were going. And you could literally prove out the equations that we were learning in class. You could, check the mass, you could check the speed, you could do all that stuff. And it's just always exciting for me to do that kind of stuff and to see these things that were developed by people that came before us, Newton and others, and then to be able to prove them out. And so it was just such a practical application of mathematics. So it stole my heart sophomore year of high school, and then when I went to college, that's what I wanted to study. I wanted to study physics, and the math major just sort of happened because I had to take a bunch of math for the physics.
Yeah.
So that was in some sense academically, at least, that was my second love. My first love was math, but my second love was physics.
Mhm.
But they're related, so
Yeah.
that's why I get excited about that stuff. So
I remember for me, once I got to understand these three in particular, the particle wave duality of light, special and general relativity, and then quantum theory, I was smitten. I was just like, wow, this is how the world really works
Mhm.
on a really large scale and a really small scale. This is so, I guess it was just so weird that it
Mhm.
just grabbed me. And I was like, wow, this is really worth thinking about and considering deeply. And so let's talk about the Big Bang. You're a Big Bang guy. You believe in the Big Bang. I know we talked about the James Webb telescope findings, which seem to indicate that the universe may be considerably older, or maybe the Big Bang is just not the best model. So
Mhm.
I'm curious, just to circle back to this subject again, how confident are you that there was a Big Bang? Like, how rock solid, for example, is the cosmic background radiation argument? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, people have been trying to poke holes in it for a long time. I mean, the cosmic background, microwave background radiation, I think it was discovered in like the 50s or 60s. And, people have been hypothesizing other ways of explaining different things. Um, and I think that there are possibly other explanations. I'm not saying that the Big Bang is the only thing that can explain everything. But I think really what's interesting is trying to contextualize this conversation from a history of, I guess, the science or the philosophy of science. Because if we were to get in a time machine and go back like 2,500 years to the time of the ancient Greeks, basically every ancient Greek philosopher that held to like what we would call an atheistic perspective or a non-theistic perspective, they would all have told you that the universe was static and it was eternal. It's like that is like the way to go if you're an atheist is or a non-theist is you have to, the original argument was it has to be static and eternal.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what we've seen in our modern science is it's certainly not static. We know it's not static. I think the eternal piece can be, people try to debate that a couple different ways. But really, it comes down to we know that it's not static. We see things moving around all the time. We know that our place in the universe is constantly in flux in some sense, in a localized sense. We're still in the Milky Way galaxy. We're out on a spiral arm. Like if you go back far enough, we look like we're not moving at all. But we know that we're moving through space. We know that we're doing things. We're rotating. We're moving around. We're doing stuff. So, how confident am I that the traditional Big Bang model is true? I would say greater than 50%. I think it's the best model out there. But I definitely don't think it's like a do or die kind of a thing. From an apologetics perspective, I think it's from my perspective, it's easier to lean into what's in vogue in science and say this is how that fits with the scriptures
Yeah.
from an apologetic perspective. And so right now, um, the Big Bang is the model in physics, at least on one level or another. And again, a lot of the atheists or non-theists will have multiple universes one way or another, and they'll have an explanation for why, like the cosmological argument doesn't prove that God exists. And I think they make some interesting points about that. But at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that the ground has shifted in the last 2,500 years from atheists or non-theists having to hold to like a static, eternal universe to now they have to explain why we're moving and why it doesn't look like the universe is eternal. I think that's huge for theists. And I think we have
Yeah.
to, that's ground that we've gained. And so
Yeah.
I think the Big Bang's part of that.
Very good. Very good. So only a little over 50%, sure.
Yeah, I'd say
That's
like
pretty
60,
low. I
60,
thought you were going to
60.
say like 90 something percent, but
No, I think I think there could be another model that comes out that does a better job of explaining all the evidence. In 50 years, we might have a whole new model
yeah.
that's called the Big Bang 2 or whatever they're going to call it. I have no idea, but
It
and then
just goes to show you, a point we've made a few times here, that you don't want to
right.
rest your salvation and your faith on our
Mm-mm.
current understanding of science.
Absolutely not.
Um, like as you explain with light, why is it behave like a wave sometimes and a particle other times? Why is it that matter deforms space, or however you want to
Right.
describe gravitational theory? Like
Right.
the physics and science, we can explain the relationship, predict a lot of times what will
Mhm.
happen based on how things work and interact. But the why questions are all philosophical, and so you
Yes.
really do need physics plus philosophy if you want a coherent explanation of the world, of the cosmos, cosmology. So
Absolutely.
I think that's a good reminder you give us.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah, and just to add to what you just said, um, as an undergrad in physics, we didn't go that far, but a lot of what the graduate students said to us was, "Hey, if you keep going down this path, you realize at some point we head into philosophy, like we become philosophers." Like
Yeah.
once you get a PhD in physics and you're trying to do like the stuff they do in CERN and collide all this stuff together, it's like, yeah, you're trying to figure all this stuff out, but at the same time the questions that are going through your mind are not like, what is this proton doing with this proton? And are we getting enough quarks? Are we getting enough particles? The question that's in your mind is, why are we here? What
Mhm.
kind of event could have led to what we see around us? And so physicists are hungry souls
Yeah.
seeking
Yeah.
for answers.
All right, well, let's talk about the cosmological argument. You just mentioned it a minute ago. How compelling do you think this argument is to prove God's existence?
Mm. Yeah, so for those that don't maybe know the formalized version of the cosmological argument, basically the idea is that the first premise is everything that exists, that begins to exist, has to have a cause. So that's the if it began to exist, it has to have a cause. And then the second thing is the universe began to exist, and which is the best scientific evidence that we have again. And then the third premise would be therefore the conclusion, the universe has to have a cause. So that's the cosmological argument. It's been popularized in modern times by William Lane Craig. And I think, look, I think it's a very powerful argument. The atheists and non-theists are very aware of the argument. It doesn't compel them. So there are answers to it, and there are reasons why you would maybe say it's not compelling in like 100% way. But I think it is if you think about like bringing someone from non-theism or atheism to theism, I think
Mhm.
it's a pretty big step along that process. Is to
Yeah.
say, what is your story for how the universe began? Okay, here's my story for how the universe began. And I think it's interesting um, that Genesis 1 gives us a creator who seems to exist at least on some level at some point outside of space and time. And there's inner Christian debate on whether God inserted himself in time or not. The open theists will argue that, but yeah, I mean, I think that you have a very good coherent explanation for how we get here and why we observe the things that we observe. Whereas I think that the atheist version of that story requires really as much faith as being a Christian does. I really do think that that's that's sort of trite. I know people have heard that before, but I really do think that that's true.
Yeah. Well, they're positing mechanisms or relationships or necessities that they have no evidence for. So those are
Correct.
faith commitments. Those are not deducible. Um,
Right.
so I did have a successful conversation one time over a lunch with an atheist friend who reluctantly admitted the force of the cosmological argument and said basically, because he just believed in the traditional Big Bang cosmology. And I said, well, that implies a beginning, and you need a cause of its beginning. And I know there are different like theories, and really, let's just be honest, there's speculations out there,
Mm-hmm.
like the quantum foam is somehow going to like burp. But like the thing is, if you don't have anything, you don't have quantum foam yet, like, and if and if the way quantum theory works is like you can quantum tunnel, but then you got to pay back the energy right away, then you have to have a big crunch, and it doesn't look like we're going to have one. So like there are so many problems with like the other speculations out there. And really the biggest problem is uh, if it's a natural process, then
Mm-hmm.
the universe would have always existed. Like a natural process, like for example, gravity doesn't decide one day to start acting,
Right.
right? So the only available explanation for a beginning is for a powerful decider to exist, i.e., God. So anyhow, we were going through this, and he was just like, he kind of like grimaced and gritted his teeth, and he's like, I have no way around that. He just like
Yeah.
blatantly admitted he had no way around it. And I said,
Yeah.
well, if that's the case, then you are not an atheist. You're a theist. And he's
Right.
like, yeah. And then didn't pursue it, was not willing to talk about it further. I
Yeah.
bought him a book, one of Tim Keller's books I thought would be really cool to go through together. And he just refused to get together. And it just goes to show you that you can win an argument. The cosmological argument is like a nuclear bomb in the arsenal of Christian apologetics, I think.
Yeah.
And still, that doesn't compel someone to pursue God or righteousness or the Bible or any of that stuff, which was a
Yeah.
really interesting learning experience for me.
Yeah, yeah, the same thing sort of happened to me in some sense with my conversation with Tom Jump, the atheist critic that I discussed. He called a debate. I was not trying to debate him, but we got to the point where I basically said, if you were to concede God's existence, like if you just said, "Hey, God exists," then wouldn't that change how you lived your life? Wouldn't that change how you even did your YouTube channel? His whole YouTube channel is fully focused on proving that God does not exist. That's the whole point of his YouTube channel.
I would
And
say
he
he has a
basically,
ministry.
oh yeah, totally,
He has
absolutely.
a, he has a religious following
He does.
to disprove God. I
Absolutely.
don't think he would
Absolutely.
like that description.
No, no, no. But yeah, no, he said that he would not change how he runs his YouTube channel. He would still, even if he knew God existed, he would focus on how the arguments for God's existence are bad arguments. And then he also added that he would probably focus a little bit more on how immoral God is. And so this is someone who I believe, like many strong atheists I know, has been hurt. They feel like they've been hurt by God. Something has happened in their past,
Mm-hmm.
and they have some other reason to not believe in God because they feel like He abandoned them or He abused them or whatever the case might be. They identify something in their past with God that wasn't God, um, and so that they have an emotional response to the God hypothesis.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is that you can prove, and people have actually proven this. Like if I went door to door, for example, and I wanted to raise money for Africa, for children, orphans in Africa, and I just went and I just read off the facts to, I went door to door. I said, there are 5 million kids in Africa that go hungry every day, and it's a bullet point, all these facts. Um, I would not be as successful as if I pulled out a picture and said, "This is Kate. Kate is 5. She lives in Uganda. She doesn't have very much food. Her mom passed away due to AIDS. She lives with her grandmother. Her grandmother can't,
Mm-hmm.
farm. If I tell the story,
And you can
if
save
I
her.
Right, exactly. And I can appeal to the emotional side of it, then you're way more successful, which is why Compassion International does things that way.
Mhm.
It's scientifically proven. So again, we enter into these conversations thinking, hey, if I win the debate, if I win the argument, then I'm going to convince X person that they're wrong, and then they'll want to join my team. And what often happens in these conversations is there's an emotional attachment to some aspects of the argument, and that you have to deal with that issue as well.
Yeah. And I think we're kind of coming into a time when we're more willing to accept the fact that we have emotional reasons underpinning our logical reasons.
Yeah.
And I can say, as a theist, someone who believes in God, that I certainly have a very significant emotional component to my decision to believe in God or to continue believing in God, despite the, say, for example, problem of evil and suffering, gratuitous suffering, and so on and so forth. So I think we all have emotions, and like for the
Yeah.
atheist to claim the high ground and be like, "Oh no, it's just logic." It's like I've seen that not work, bud. Like so. Anyhow, you talked about a couple of these defeaters for the Big Bang Theory, the oscillating universe theory, and the multiverse. I think a lot of us, well, I could just speak for myself, having boys and teenagers, that there's a lot of TV shows, especially on like the superhero genre, that make use of the multiverse theory as a plot device. And so I think it's like pretty much commonly accepted today as being true without any evidence at all, because it's just like such a good way to tell stories and to like bring back a character from the dead and then have them die again and then bring them back again. And, so I
Yeah.
don't know. What are your thoughts? Well, let me go back to the oscillating. The oscillating idea is that the universe expands and then it crunches, then it expands, then it crunches. So let's address that one real quick.
Yeah, yeah.
First.
So when because you have a beginning, you have to have a way to have either an internal universe, which is where the multi-universe sort of comes in, or you have to have an infinite number of universes throughout a period of time. And that's so the second one, the one I just explained, is an oscillating universe. It's the idea that you have I don't know, some people would describe it almost as like a machine. You have this universe building machine, and it just pops open a universe, and then it crunches back in because it doesn't have enough push out, and gravity just recollapses it. And this happens, and you imagine that every time that this happens, all the physical constants, everything that we talk about in the fine tuning session of the class, all those different constants, the phase, space, volume, all these things just get randomized every time, and boom, okay, that one didn't work. Boom, that one didn't work. It's like a Essen's light bulb experiment, or any other, like you trying to bake a bread at home. It's like, oh, that bread didn't work. Let's try a different bread. It's like, how many times do you have to explode a universe and watch it crunch again before you get like the Goldilocks universe, where like all the constants are perfect and everything expands and it doesn't recombine very quickly and all that stuff. And so that's the oscillating universe
Well, isn't there a
model.
problem too with thermodynamics and just like the idea of sort of like a loss as entropy kind of gets into the system each time? There's a loss. So like
Right.
eventually you probably have smaller universes, and then over trillions of years, no universes, right? Like the
Correct.
system would
Yeah.
run out of usable energy.
Yeah, assuming the thermodynamics held at that time, you're exactly right. Like you would want to succeed earlier, and because of the uh, the fine tuning that we observe, it just seems bizarre that it would be like the fifth universe that pops out that would be the right one.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it has to be like the numbers are staggering. The odds are staggering. So the other
Well,
problem with
but
the
it still
oscillating,
requires a beginning, right?
it does, and that's why, like I said, people tend that have a non-theistic or atheistic view it like there's like a quantum field or some machine that's producing these universes one after another. You have to have something
Well, then you still have to
providing
explain
input.
that. Where does that come from?
Yeah, they
Where's the
won't. They won't.
generator come from? Does it
They
have a
won't.
beginning?
They won't. They won't go. That's as far back as they're willing to go in the conversations I've had and the things that I've read. So, but the other problem with that is it's inherently non-provable, because if a universe existed in the past temporally, and I'm not saying like multiverse, I'm talking about multiple universes, but it existed in the past. If that universe does not exist anymore, imagine we're on the trillionth universe that's ever existed.
Yeah.
We would still never be able to ever see any aspect of those ancient universes, and there's none of it's left. It's all gone. Like every single bit of matter that ever existed in any of those universes is all gone. So from a purely philosophical perspective, a scientific perspective, it's not science. It's a
Yeah.
religion. Like
Yeah. I
you'd
mean,
have to define that as a religion.
it's like the belief that every planet beyond the range of our uh, tools to measure or see is made of cheese.
Right.
It's just like an
Right.
idea that you can't disprove. So
Right.
what's the point in really
Non-verifiable.
talking about it? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Uh, all right. Give me a short nutshell explanation. Somebody says to you, Will, we've got a multiverse. It's obvious. Everybody knows it. How would you defeat that in a brief way with somebody?
Yes. So first I'll speak really briefly to the Marvel concept of the multiverse.
Yes, the Marvel concept in particular.
So the Marvel concept is really fun, right? Because you have this idea of these people living in parallel universes, but people that believe in multiverses from a scientific perspective, as far as I understand it, they don't conceptualize it that way. They would imagine universes existing separate from one another. So in the vast majority of those universes, there'd be no life at all, much less another me or another you having a similar conversation. Or maybe we'd be on Tom Jump's channel explaining why we think he's right, in a different universe, And so that kind of multiverse doesn't exist. I mean, we can imagine it philosophically every time we make a decision that there's a whole nother universe that opens it up or something like that. But yeah, there's just no grounding at all in any of that. There's no other like will that exists out in another universe. I don't think many people really take those kinds of things seriously. This idea that there are multiple universes like outside of our own, like imagine a bunch of marbles in a cabinet. There's a bunch of marbles in a cabinet. One of those universes is our universe, and someone could examine it and see, oh, there's a little speck in there that has life on it. And from an atheist perspective, there might be a lot of other specks that have life on it or whatever. That's sort of what I conceive of as a multiverse. And again, you run into the same problem with the oscillating universe. It's just inherently unverifiable. There's no way to measure it, find it, figure it out. And scientifically, we know it's never going to happen. We're never going to be able to observe it. So yeah, it really fails the same way the oscillating universe does. It's just completely unverifiable and is just in the realm of science fiction and philosophy, basically.
Yeah. And there's no other aspect of our experience that helps explain. Like for
No.
example, with the God hypothesis, you have some being that is eternal and can decide, all right, let's create time. Let's get this thing going. And then you also have people, I mean, an incredible number of people on the present day planet Earth claiming to have God experiences. And you've got historical claims that people have experienced God in different ways. And you've also got, the fine tuning, which makes sense if there was a designer that things are well designed, so you really have a whole range of compelling, maybe not compelling, but persuading reasons that together I think are pretty compelling to believe in the God hypothesis. Let's talk about your, what do you want to call it, discussion with Tom Jump?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about that briefly. I don't know if any of you who are watching this have seen this conversation, but it's certainly an interesting one. You talked about fine tuning in that, and kind of just camped out on that as your main focus for that conversation. I guess you didn't want to like overwhelm him with a lot of different arguments at the same time.
Yeah.
And he focused his attention on God as the suitable object of the design inference. So he granted the apparent fine tuning and granted that there should be a cause of it, but denied that God was at all a plausible candidate. So long as he can punt to as yet undiscovered natural constraints or an infinite series of universes or multiverse, which we just talked about, with random initial conditions, he doesn't feel the pressure of this argument that you brought up to him. What do you think you could how do you think you could have said it to strengthen your case a little bit, to, make them squirm a little more when you
Yeah.
brought it
So
up?
yeah, so Tom Jump is unique among the atheists that I've come across in a lot of respects because he grants things that are really bizarre to grant. Like he believes in objective morality, which for an atheist is just bizarre. Like the vast majority of atheists will reject absolute morality. And so I think he tries to everything that he does, he hangs everything on the science of the gaps kind of argument that we were talking about earlier. This idea that maybe in the future we might discover something in
Yeah.
physics or something in biology or something in chemistry or geology that would entail something about like absolute morality. And I made a decision going into the conversation that I was not going to push back super hard on the stuff that he was saying because I wanted his audience to hear the gospel message, which I was able to get out. I think aspects of it really surprised him. I don't think he'd heard of someone who like denied the existence of hell, for example, before. That sort of caught him off guard. And the idea
Mhm.
of a kingdom, being on the earth was unique to him. Was one of the first times he's heard that before, I think. So there were some things that I got in that I worked in that were good, but getting back to fine tuning, look, I think he's right in some respect about fine tuning. And he's interviewed people like Robin Collins, professional physicist who is the fine tuning expert that Lee Strobel talked to in The Case for a Creator. And Robin Collins says, look, the fine tuning argument by itself does not win the debate. Like you have to use these other things like you were talking about just a second ago. You have the argument for morality, you have the cosmological argument, you have the personal experience. And there were things that I wanted to talk about that I didn't have the chance to talk about or bring up, or I mentioned them briefly, but then he never returned to them. But when it comes to like strengthening our argument as a whole, I think it's just having all these different things in our arsenal, understanding what the cosmological argument, what it is, understanding the argument for fine tuning, understanding the argument for morality, um, and and handling all those things. But the one thing that I wish I could have shared with him that I think is a missing piece, um, that a lot of times we have to connect for people, is the idea that the Bible or the way that God relates to humanity is special and privileged and can be scientifically verified on some level. And I give an example at the end of the class about this. I'll sort of spill the beans on now for people who haven't heard it. But the idea that Moses could come out of the Egyptian world where their view of medicine was like you just take some poop and you put it on your blister or you put on your infection, right?
Yeah.
And but that's, I mean, like we have that, we know that that's what they thought, and that's
Yeah.
the worldview he comes from. That's where he was trained, and yet you have modern practices, spelled out in Leviticus about like, if you get this disease, you go quarantine outside of camp.
Mhm.
This is what you do with your excrement. This is what
A lot of
it's like
washings too.
how to wash exactly and
Mhm.
when, and so you look at all of that and it's like there's a text that shows an understanding of germ theory 3,000 years before germ theory is discovered, and there really is not a good answer to that.
Yeah.
And so I wish I would have hit some of those blows in the conversation I had with Tom. Those are some of the things I was planning to talk about if we had time, and we spent
Yeah.
a lot of time on fine tuning. But I agree with him. I think that fine tuning by itself does not end the debate, because you could imagine, especially in the realm of physics, you could imagine that like the idea, the Big Bang, there could have been some constraints that we're just not aware of that we just can't see right now, and that's why all the constants are tied into these little dials. And I could see an atheist imagining that. What I can't understand an atheist imagining without some real psychological pressure, cognitive dissonance, sort of really putting a lot of pressure on them, is I don't see how they understand those Levitical passages without really losing sleep at night, and the cosmological argument and the morality argument and all the things that we can bring to bear as a
Yeah.
cohesive whole. So
Yeah. I wonder what his reason for absolute morals is. He uses this phrase. I forget what it is off the top of my head, but it's like a philosophical phrase that ethicists use, I suppose. And that's a real sort of awkward turning of the tables you could do, is ask him, well, where do you think absolute morals come from? Right? Like
right,
normally that's what the atheist would ask the Christian, right?
right,
But you could ask him, since he's
right.
going to affirm that. I think the obvious place for human morality on atheism would be naturalistic evolution, that would be the generator of our mores. And if you look at evolution, boy, you don't want to live by that code, the survival of the fittest, unless you are the fittest, and then maybe you do want to live by that code. But that's not the kind of world I want to live in, or anyone else
Right.
that is not at the very apex of physical or whatever fitness. So that might be another interesting one um, to talk about. Um, the other thing I was thinking about Tom Jump is that whenever he comes against personal experience in interviews, he just like won't engage at all.
Mm-mm. Yeah.
And I almost think like maybe pushing him on that a little bit. Like, do you just think that these like millions of people are all just in a big conspiracy together? Do you
Right.
think they're all just dumb and you're smart?
Right. Yeah.
Like, I mean, what is the hypothesis behind that you tell yourself to explain away people reporting this?
Right.
Um, I'm reminded of the example or the illustration that Josh Anderson used in his evangelism class, where he talked about how Neil Armstrong could attend a conspiracy landing on the moon event, where everyone there is convinced that there was no landing on the moon, and
Right.
had all these sophisticated arguments about like the way the flag looked in the picture and all these other things, that there's not enough dust on the moon, whatever. Like, you've got all these different theories. And what would Neil Armstrong even say to that? And he said, well, he might say something like, well, you guys bring up some really good arguments. I'm not really sure how to defeat them. I'm not sure where the flaw in the logic is, but I stood on the moon. So I'm still convinced that it happened, even though I don't have answers to your
Right.
well conceived objections. And I think that's the way a lot of Christians are, and theists of other religions. They're like, well, I've experienced supernatural stuff.
Right.
And so because of that, I'm just like not really sure how to answer you, but I'm still not convinced by your worldview. It just seems incredibly implausible based on my human experience. So I don't know if that would work or not. He's a professional debater. He literally debates this one thing every day, full
All day.
time,
Yeah.
salaried.
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah.
so it's not going to be an easy one. Are you thinking about going back for another round at some point, or are you just letting it go? Or
No, no, I'm letting it go. Again, there are things I wanted to talk about that I felt like would have been fun, and I left him breadcrumbs to possibly ask me about some of that stuff, and I just let him lead it where he wanted to go, and he just wanted to really grill me on fine tuning and really wanted to grill me on morality, and that's not what I came prepared to talk about. I came prepared to talk about Levitical standards and about my personal experience, and I just sort of dropped those two as an example of like, here are two. If you want like a fun philosophical debate, you've done this 1,000 times, and he just really zeroed in on that.
yeah,
Those two things, because that's his specialty. He probably knew if I started bringing up Levitical stuff and if I start talking about my personal experience, he's going to check out, and so that's, I wanted to engage him more directly than I think he engaged Carlos, because Carlos just went the personal experience route, and then Tom was just like, okay, let's get into the audience questions. So I wanted to engage him a little bit more than that.
yeah.
But I don't think it was not my most successful attempt. I'll put it that way.
So let's talk about the weak anthropic principle. You mentioned that in reference to, I think, was it Stephen Hawking or Richard Dawkins, one of those guys?
Yeah, Richard Dawkins. Yeah,
Richard Dawkins. So you said that you don't think that's a convincing defeater for fine tuning. You mentioned a quote
yeah.
by Stephen Meyer. Could you explain that a little further? Like, basically, the weak anthropic principle, as I understand it, is the idea that because we're here, the world is finely tuned. And if it weren't finely tuned, we wouldn't be here. But because we are here, it means it was. So what's the big deal? Right.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
not special that it's finely tuned. It's like it's a necessity that if I exist, it would have to be.
Right.
Um, so what do
Yeah,
you think?
the Stephen Meyer quote, for those that maybe aren't as familiar with it, he basically just talks about how just because you have a necessary condition for an event, it doesn't mean that you don't have to have a causal explanation for the same event. And he used the example of like I think it was the Chicago fire he talks about, where it's like, okay, the Chicago fire happened in history. We know it happened.
Hmm.
And oh, we needed oxygen. Like oxygen had to exist to have that fire. His point was like oxygen, the presence or absence of oxygen doesn't explain like why did the fire take place. Like, and
Okay.
there's a historical reason that the fire took place. That particular fire, really any particular fire. There's,
So
you
necessity and causation are two independent axes, really, for
right,
explaining
exactly.
something. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
to use a different example that lives closer to home for me, I have a almost 6 week old at home now, but for him to get here, we know like scientifically you need a sperm, you need an egg, and that they have to combine. But what's the story that leads to that point? What's the there's a scientific piece of it, but then there's all the background causes and the explanation for it, because we can do that in a lab somewhere. We can combine those elements together. There's lots of different ways that can happen, and so we have to understand the causal piece behind it. And so yeah, the weak anthropic principle, to me, it just sort of begs the question. It just sort of says, hey, we're here having this conversation, what's the big deal? And it's like, well, the big deal is that we can look out in that sky and we don't see anything. We don't see any life anywhere, at least anything like us. We might find microbes here and there on different asteroids, but we're not seeing life like us anywhere, at least not yet.
Mhm.
And so there's a reason. We have to think about like what led us to this point. And
Yeah.
I think science can do a lot of that. I think science can bear a lot of that burden. But as we talked about earlier about physics, at some point physics becomes philosophy. At some point, all these sciences, they go past what we can observe physically, and it's down to the deeper questions of life. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the size of the universe for a minute, which kind of came up in one of these sessions. A criticism of creationism is that the universe is so empty. It's a great waste of space. If God designed our universe for us to explore, why are the
Mhm.
stars so far away? For example, Proxima Centauri, which is in the Alpha Centauri system, is 4.25 light years or 40 trillion kilometers away. Our fastest spacecraft is the Parker Solar Probe, which, after slingshotting around the sun, travels at 531,000 kilometers an hour, which is incredibly fast. But even at that speed, it would take someone 8,642 years to reach the closest star. So,
Mhm.
if that's really the case, why is everything so far away? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's sort of what Victor Stenger says in his book "God: The Failed Hypothesis." I mean, there's a couple different reasons I think we could imagine that God had to do things this way. I think the first would be necessity. That there's some reason from a particle's perspective, like if the stars were too close, or if that it wouldn't be suitable for life.
Mm.
And so that's one possibility, is that you could imagine the universe as one big watch, and the watch has to have all the gears in the right spots in order to do things. And I will say, I believe I mentioned in the class, but if I didn't, I'll add it here. We're in a specific spot in the spiral arm of the Milky Way galaxy where we can observe a lot of different things. If we were further in the Milky Way galaxy, we would experience probably a little bit more radiation, which may or may not, that may not be a good thing.
Yeah.
But secondarily, we wouldn't be able to see as much as we can see in the telescopes as we send them out. There'd be a lot more light around us, hiding stuff further away. And so we're uniquely in the Milky Way galaxy. We're uniquely positioned for discovery, using telescopes and using the technology that we have. And again, I don't think that that's accidental. Um, so the second thing I would say is, who's to say that this life is the only life where we're going to observe these things? It's very possible. I know we've talked about it over beers before. It's very possible that we'll get to explore some of the stuff in the eternal kingdom.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to minimize that fact. I certainly hope that as someone who loves physics, I certainly hope that that's a possibility.
Yeah.
That would be, because that would be amazing. So I do
Or
think that,
technology, even
right.
prior to the age to come, it's entirely possible that some way of transporting ourselves could come along that can somehow cheat the speed of light speed limit.
Yeah.
And at this point, we don't know what that would look like. Well, I mean, it depends on how into sci-fi you are, but there's always a mechanism in every sci-fi book I read. Um,
Yeah.
And who's to say that we won't develop that technology? You might have said the
Right.
same exact thing about the continents.
Totally.
They're so far apart, nobody could ever swim across. Well, then they invented a
Right.
boat, and then the boat developed enough so that you could survive through a storm,
Right.
right? And then over time, longitude was a big deal. That was huge, being able to develop that. They had these like hourglasses that they would use to keep track of time and then measure the sun at noon, right? And then they would be able to tell like how far out they were. And now we have GPS, we got a
Right.
plane, like it's just for me to go to the other side of the world takes a day. I could go to the other side
Right.
of the world in a day. That's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
But somebody 3,000 years ago would be like, God, why did you make it this way? We'll never get there. Right. It's almost the
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
argument.
Totally. Yeah.
So I didn't think of that till just now, but like, I think, we need to kind of relax a little bit on thinking we are the pinnacle in this particular moment of time in 2022, that we've already
Right.
reached the pinnacle of civilization and everything should be for us.
Right. Yeah. I think it's helpful to think about that from a historical perspective, like you just said. I was talking to someone the other week about how we look at ancient Egypt, for example, as ancient history. We have Egyptologists that study ancient Egypt, but I think it's bizarre to hear that ancient Egypt had Egyptologists. Those dynasties, that civilization lasted over 2,000 years. So you had people studying ancient Egypt in ancient Egypt, what we would call ancient Egypt.
Wow.
And so, it's like, so when we approach these problems, like you're talking about, problems of philosophy of science, like these, like, why is everything so spread out? We'll never get there. Well, like you said, maybe in 3,000 years, we will be headed beyond that. Or maybe
Yeah.
Jesus will return and we'll be headed beyond that, doing other stuff anyway, with really cool spiritual technology. I don't know.
Yeah. Or dimensional, like if we can access another spatial dimension, that's just a whole game changer as
Yeah,
far as transportation
wormholes.
goes. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, wormholes. Yeah.
Um, so how do you respond to the criticism on fine tuning that says, um, saying that God is the explanation effectively ends any further scientific inquiry on the subject? That
Yeah, I
like
mean,
basically
yeah,
believing in God is a science killer.
right. Yeah, it's sort of a weird like redefinition of God of the gaps. God of the gaps is the idea that, oh, I can't explain why the apple fell, so I'll just say God pushed the apple down, and then Newton discovers gravity. And it's like, oh, now we have a scientific explanation for why the apple fell. I would just say that throughout history, that's just not true. Like all of our great scientists in the Renaissance era, at least many of them were devout Christians. Newton was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
But many of them, Galileo. So anyway, I just don't think that belief in God in any way inhibits free thinking. I would actually probably argue the opposite, because what I've seen from atheists and from non-theists is that when the design inference is strong, when we look at the universe around us and we say, hey, this looks weird, like how did this happen the way that it did, they are not willing to open themselves up to a supernatural explanation. And one of the things I talk about at the beginning of our scripture and science class is our worldview should be collected from the things that make for the best explanation of everything, the most comprehensive explanation of everything. And so if we can do physics plus God, if we can do chemistry plus God, biology plus God, I think we're going to go further than if we just do physics and we don't allow for miracles, we don't allow for any supernatural events.
Yeah.
Because like you said, there are many, many things in history, including the resurrection of Jesus, that have strong historical basis to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so are you going to now change your historiography because you don't want to believe what happened? And that's what happens, is the rules start changing because we want to exclude the miracles, exclude supernaturalism.
Yeah.
And I think that's an unnecessary assumption. And I think it's actually more open inquiry to say maybe sometimes supernatural stuff is involved.
Yeah.
That leads to more open inquiry in my mind.
Mm-hmm. And I think also asking the question, how?
Right.
Like, all right, God made it, but how?
Totally.
Um,
Or why?
or,
That's the
or why?
philosophical
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Purpose,
Yeah.
and we didn't mention this before, but like, that's something else to consider, is that like God did tell us he did this.
Hmm.
Like he did like supervise, inspire, protect a book
Right.
or a
Yeah.
series of books
Yeah.
so that people would know.
Right.
And it's not like we're left with just assumptions here. Like we do also have the voice of God contained in Scripture, especially, you read the prophets. Thus says the Lord, right? I mean, it's a direct claim to direct speech there. Um, well, let's just conclude by talking about it a little bit more on fine tuning. When you talk to people about this, how do they react? I know a lot of people are turned off by scientific conversations, and you are super sciencey in this class. And some people are just like getting triggered by bad experiences in high school, I think. And so, how do you have any tips to making it interesting when you talk to people?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to go at whatever speed the person that you're engaging with can go at, and so some people do have trauma. I'm a former math teacher, and so whenever I hear people say, "Oh man, I hated math in middle school and high school," my usual response is, "Well, maybe if you'd had me, it would have been different. I don't know. Hopefully, that usually diffuses that bomb a little bit." But yeah, I mean, I think that people do have weaknesses or blind spots when it comes to science and math, or some of these deeper questions that we're asking in this class. And so you never want to force someone to engage in something that they're not interested in. And so yeah, there will be some people that, for example, will come across this class and they'll just be like, "Nope, not interested. This is not my cup of tea.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in prayer and how to raise my kids, and I don't want to think about all these things," until maybe their kids are 15 or 16 and they start asking them questions
Hmm.
like,
Or they go off to college and they start asking questions.
totally, yeah. And so yeah, what I really think is, I think people have to have some sort of investment in already, probably, that they want to talk about, or they want to know more about these kinds of subjects. Um, and if they do have any interest, I think it's really important. One of the things that I think the disposition of this class helps with is, it helps people understand that there's a space and there's this time that we're giving you to consider a lot of different aspects of this. Not every aspect, because I don't know all the aspects, and even if I did, I couldn't do it in 16 30-minute segments. But to give you some time and some space and a place where you feel comfortable, where
Mhm.
we're going to talk about different ways of working through it in a way that's not confrontational. And I think if people can go to these conversations with that kind of a disposition, where it's not, "Hey, I'm going to convince you that this is the only way of reading Genesis," but, "Hey, here are a couple different ways of reading Genesis, and oh, this is how it would work out under this way, this is how it would work out under that way." Or like with fine tuning, be like, "Hey, like, there's things in fine tuning that are really mathematical." And then it's like, also, we look up in the night sky, we see eclipses. Like, that's super cool. Like, why is that a thing?
Yeah.
Like, why are
There's no
eclipses a
there's no
thing?
reason for that to be
Right.
so. Yeah.
Right.
It's
And
just
so
sort of like a
just
bonus. I call
right.
it flair. Like
It
God's
is
the
flair.
artist and he's like, watch this. They're gonna love
Right.
this
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. Yeah. Or just like mathematics. I mean, some of this mathematical stuff is just unbelievable. F equals ma. Why is F equal ma? It's like, there's no
That's
reason why it
that's
has
pretty
to.
elegant.
Yeah. So there's just these things that just um that are clues. I think breadcrumbs that lead us. But yeah, I think if people want to have these conversations and they're getting resistance because of something, I think making space for multiple views is a good thing, a good move to make early in the conversation. And if people still aren't interested, just say, "Hey, if you ever want to talk about it another time, we can talk about it another time."
Yeah.
So
All right. Thanks, Will, for your time today. I appreciate it.
thanks for having me, Sean.